Let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Finding and Tapping Volunteer Talent, Recruitment and Cultivation. My name is Lily, and I am AZFBN's Agency Training Coordinator. Today, we have Beth Steinhorn, President of VQ Volunteer Strategies. Beth partners with organizations and their leadership to increase impact through strategic and innovative engagement. She's an author of multiple books and articles, and she's part of the national conversation about strategic engagement. It frequently provides training on this specific topic, and she consults with organizations through the US and Canada. There will be a time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to use the chat box located at the bottom, and we'll jot down those questions. Lastly, we ask that you keep your microphone muted as a courtesy to everyone that is speaking. Now, without further ado, Beth, go ahead and take it over.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lily, for asking me to be part of this new series. I'm really delighted to be joining you from just a little north and east of you all. I'm based in Colorado. Today's topic is recruitment, and I'd love to get your at least proverbial voices in the room and ask you to, especially since we're a small group, to use the chat to introduce yourself and share, again, in the chat, are you actively recruiting, and what's one tactic that appears to remain effective for volunteer recruitment even amid the pandemic? So again, give maybe the organization or town where you're based, and if you're recruiting and if you have an effective tactic to share, please feel free to type that in the chat, and we'll revisit those throughout. But again, since we're a small group, we'd love to get your voices in the room. While you're typing, hopefully, I will dive in and just share an initial question, which is, what is recruitment? We have a lot of images when we hear the term volunteer recruitment. We might immediately imagine these hands raised, volunteers needed, let's find people to come. The old "we want you" of Uncle Sam, other images that may be evoked when you hear about recruitment. But when it really comes down to effective volunteer recruitment, what remains primary, despite all the amazing advances in technology, is the personal ask. Two people sitting down together virtually or in person and having somebody ask someone else to come and share their time and their skills to help a cause that they care about. So that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be chatting about strategic cultivation. What does it mean to strategically invite people to share their time and skills? And I see Lisa weighed in from a food bank saying, yes, we're actively recruiting and friend referrals. So again, that peer-to-peer recruitment is what Lisa's experiencing as positive, and I think we'll be chatting about that as well today. We definitely want to tailor our strategies to trends that we're seeing in volunteerism nationally, but more importantly in Arizona and in your communities, and the types of trends that you're facing. I understand that many of you are likely dialing in from rural areas across the state. And I don't need to tell you some of the trends you may be experiencing, and feel free to, again, use the chat to weigh in if any of these sound familiar. But in terms of common trends faced by rural organizations, we see, in terms of the communities, we see out migration. Rural populations have been growing at a lower rate than the rest of the US, at least 2018, 2019. And that's after years of actually decline in rural populations due to mostly young people moving to urban areas for work or education or other reasons. We also see social isolation, especially among older adults. 1 in 4 seniors, 65 years of age and older, live in rural areas and small towns, and sometimes they lack transport And other factors are challenges as well, which certainly has been a key factor in the last year for sure. Poverty. Rural counties have added jobs, but at half the rate of urban counties. Even though poverty has gone down in rural areas, it's still higher than the urban rate. Reduced services, lack of infrastructure or smaller, more burdened infrastructure, hospitals, schools, increased needs for services, which is points to all of you filling that gap. And finally, limited connectivity. In the US, rural areas have had disproportionate amounts of lack of connectivity, though certainly efforts over the past year may have helped to close that gap. So that's trends in terms of population that you may be experiencing to varying degrees, but how does that affect volunteerism in rural areas? Well, we see volunteers aging out. That's not unique to rural organizations. That's true in many urban organizations as well. We see volunteer burnout because we may be relying on what we at my company call the STP. It's a very technical term. It means the same 10 people. And if you're a really small organization, it may be standing for the same 2 people, right? And if you're big, it may be the same 30 people. But that STP, those are the people that we keep calling and relying on, and inevitably they may be experiencing some burnout. Finally, another big trend in rural volunteerism, which again is not unique to rural volunteerism, but is especially prevalent there, is informal volunteering. We may have structures for very good reasons that we have infrastructure in place to support and make volunteering more formal, but many people may have different reactions to that, maybe due to cultural backgrounds, maybe due to just a lack of interest in committing or feeling comfortable making a long-term commitment, and yet are very motivated to help out, to assist, to help a neighbor, even if that isn't, that's an informal way of volunteering. It's not part of our more formal construct of volunteering. So those are some of the challenges or trends that you're facing in your areas, whether urban or rural, because they're not, as I said, they're not completely unique to rural areas. And so it's a real challenge because especially many of those things have been accelerated over the last year with the pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about trends given the events of the last year. Despite all of the challenges, research by Points of Light, our nation's largest organization to advocate for volunteerism, demonstrates that while 36% of survey respondents, adult Americans, participated in volunteer activities in the year prior to this survey, which was a couple months into the pandemic. While that was 36% of adult Americans, the interesting news is that more than double that, 73% of those same survey respondents believe that volunteering will be more important than ever after the coronavirus pandemic passes. So we have an opportunity to say, okay, we know we've had limited engagement opportunities, but there's an interest out there from volunteers far away who might be able to engage virtually with us, and even those close by who see volunteering as a way to help us rebuild. In fact, despite the sweeping disruption and devastation felt by the pandemic, individuals are inspired to volunteer. 85% of nonprofits, as of the end of last summer, were reporting increases in volunteer interest. And 95% of individuals believe they'll be at least as involved or do more to support their community once the pandemic passes. And it's a lot of young people, Gen Z, these young adults in their teens and early 20s that are most likely of all generations to get more involved. So we have an opportunity to do what I like to say, we have the big choice when it comes to trends. We can keep doing what we've always done and work despite the trends, or we can shift some of our practices and work to leverage the trends as we move forward. So hopefully with that perspective, we'll be able to look at some of the trends in recruitment that may equip you to move forward differently. Certainly, and I'll be coming back to some of these things, in terms of solutions that many rural organizations have already had in play prior to the pandemic that has served them well moving through the last year, has been these that are on the screen here. Asset mapping, starting from our strengths, what works well, who's already volunteering, what institutions or organizations can we partner with to tap into their volunteer spirit, even if it's not called volunteerism. And what are some of the sources, new sources for volunteers, youth and students, seniors and retirees, and workplace sponsored volunteering. So we'll try and unpack some of those as we move forward. I see from the comments that we have after Lisa's, friend referrals are great. Monique and Scott have shared some challenges. Monique from the Apache Nation Food Bank recruiting, but not as successfully as she'd like. And Scott says trying to recruit, but most who are interested are older. So hopefully some of these ideas today that I'll be sharing and that you will share peer-to-peer may share some successful strategies to help diversify your age group. So let's get back to this concept of recruitment. I'm going to be using the terms recruitment and cultivation somewhat interchangeably today, but at their core, I see them as two different or overlapping strategies. When we talk about recruitment, we often talk about traditional volunteer recruitment, which is externally faced, trying to get new people into our organizations. And often that happens by saying, can you do this? I have this opportunity. Will you please help us by saying yes to doing this thing that we've structured and that we have, will you be our round peg that will fit into all of the round holes that we have available? Cultivation, on the other hand, is a little broader and it's more relationship based. Think about how we use the term cultivation when we talk about fund development. We don't say we're going to recruit a donor and once we have a donor, we're checking it off the list and we're good to go. We cultivate donors and continue to nurture that relationship ongoingly. It's the same thing with individuals who donate their time. Instead of saying, can you do this or can you do this? What is it like if we ask the question, what skills would you like to share with us if we could make it possible for you to do so? It's not just a yes, no answer. It becomes the start of a conversation where you can begin to tap interested individuals for different types of work and perhaps tap your current volunteers for more or different work. Do you know the skills of your current volunteers? Do you know their interests in doing something different? Are they interested in leadership roles? Are they interested in working remotely and virtually for your food pantry, for your food bank? Do they have friends that they can invite to volunteer? Do they have workplace volunteering that they might be able to connect your food bank to? So that's where we look at this cultivation as a strategy that's much broader than simply recruitment. They certainly both involve finding the right message to ask the right people, the likely group of individuals who have the skills and availability that might align with your needs to pursue their interests and skills. And of course, timing is everything. The right message and the skills piece is really all about job design, but timing certainly is involved in how successful your recruitment efforts are going to be, as well as who does the asking. So let's talk a little bit about this piece about job design. I think it's vitally important that whenever we're talking about recruitment, we first look at what are we recruiting people to do, to fill. And that starts with position descriptions. I'm a huge advocate for the importance of position descriptions for any individual who's involved with engaging volunteers. Position descriptions, which are not a marketing tool yet, They give you the tools you need to market, but they're not an ad, they're not an advertisement. But a position description, the process of writing a position description, first and foremost, gives you the opportunity to assess, is this a strategic role for volunteers to fill? In other words, and I don't usually publish this type of name for it, but in my mind, the other name for a position description is, would anyone in their right mind want to do this role? Right? So you need to read your position descriptions. Thank you, Paula. You're nodding. You're agreeing, right? You need to read and say, would anyone in their right mind be interested in doing this position? Because maybe it's a position description that needs to be broken into 3 different roles. Or maybe it's something that could be job shared by 2 people. Or maybe it's just busy work and no one in their right mind would want to do it. So how can we beef it up? So first, it helps us assess the role and whether it's strategic and attractive. Second, it gives us the information we need to write a strategic cultivation message, which I'll share some examples of or some tools to create shortly. It then provides the information you need to properly screen and vet volunteers and then hold them accountable. And it even gives you the tools to help you celebrate, evaluate their impact, and recognize volunteers for their work. So I can and have, spent hours talking just about position descriptions, but we need to get to the recruitment piece. Let me share a little bit about position descriptions, what I think goes into them and how that feeds into the recruitment. So each of these elements are what we at VQ think and work with our clients are important to incorporate into any solid position description. A title. Volunteer isn't a title. That's a pay grade. It's not a title. You want a meaningful title for your volunteer role. What are the key responsibilities? Not the laundry list of everything that the person does, but the 3 to 5 things for which they're responsible. Impact and outcome. Here's where it gets really important and where most position descriptions I see are lacking. What's the difference this volunteer role will make for your mission? That's the key piece. The rest, training and support, commitment, qualifications, benefits, you can read about those, fill them in, but here's an example of a sample position description for a volunteer who's helping to, this is a real position description from a client of ours in rural New Hampshire. This was a volunteer who was going to help create a volunteer handbook, which would be used in supporting and expanding their volunteer program. And they're looking for a team leader to head up this volunteer handbook team. The responsibilities are to gather and review samples of handbooks, to help design theirs, to lead and support a team who are going to help draft it, and to revise and edit according to input. But the interesting piece is the time it takes and the information that surfaces when you do initial impact and sustained outcomes. Initial impact, writing a handbook may not sound all that exciting, but when you can say, by joining this team or being the team leader, you are going to help ensure that new and returning volunteers have a consistent level of knowledge and understand their connection to our mission. That volunteers are going to be able to more closely see the value of their work and understand how their position connects to the bigger picture of our mission. Volunteers are going to be happier as of their initial experience. They're going to stay longer and they're going to serve as ambassadors who elevate our reputation in the rest of the community. That's a big thing to be able to articulate that comes from the position description and helps fuel your recruitment messages. Here's another example. A recruitment team leader. You're on this call because you may be having some challenges in recruiting. You might want to put a task force together to help of volunteers to help you design and enhance your recruitment efforts. So the key responsibilities would be to create a team of volunteers to develop and implement a peer-to-peer recruitment strategy, lead that team in piloting some new innovations in recruitment, and to evaluate how effective it is. The impact is that current volunteers will have the information and tools they need to inspire others to serve. More people will know about our food bank. And yes, more of our shifts will be filled. But what's the long-term outcomes? Well, more departments and programs will be able to deliver their critical services. Staff will be freed up to do work for which they're uniquely qualified. And the organization will have a more sustainable pipeline of volunteers and advocates. So you can begin to see how these examples can fuel effective recruitment messages. And let me also make a note that following this webinar, Lily will be sending out a series of handouts, including a PDF of these slides. So you will get a copy of this via email. If you want to refer back to these, you don't have to furiously write, though you're welcome to, or you don't have to. Think about when you're crafting personal ask or virtual online asks, consider some other pieces of the research that came out from that Points of Light research that I shared, which is that from the volunteer perspective, even though there are many people saying that, 73% saying that volunteering is going to be more vital than ever post-pandemic, there was great agreement around what a worthwhile experience would be for potential volunteers. And those are experiences that are discoverable. They need to be able to find it. So we'll talk about that. They're local, which I think positions each of you well as local food banks. Credible, they need to be authentic and from, an organization with a decent reputation. Social, are they going to be able to interact with other people? And maybe they don't have to be all of these things, but these are the things that most volunteers said they're looking for. Authentic, personal, impactful, and despite the fact that there are trends showing over and over again that volunteers are more reluctant than ever to make a long-term commitment, they're still interested in experiences that are repeatable. So can they sign up for one, but might they have a chance to do more? When these elements are present, most people say that they'll make time to volunteer. So you should leverage everything at your disposal to help communicate these things. Talk to your current volunteers and equip them with messages to send out. Use volunteer search engines like Volunteer Match or your state service commission or any other local volunteer centers. Craigslist sometimes has volunteer listings, social media, partnerships and groups, and of course that peer-to-peer piece. And how do you take a position description, which I said is vital, but is not a recruitment message, and turn that into something that is a recruitment message? Well, you can start by simply writing 9 sentences, 3 sentences that describe the impact of the work. What's the difference that someone filling this position is going to make? 3 sentences on the impact of the organization. What's your mission and how might this role tie to equipping, building capacity of your pantry, your food bank to get more meals out, to help alleviate poverty, to help address critical needs? And then the description of the actual tasks and commitment. Once you have those 9 sentences, you have what you need to really craft something that fits many different possible advertising avenues for volunteer roles. It can formulate an email that you send out, or a little article in your newsletter, or that of another organization's newsletter. You can use it to craft an ad on Volunteer Match or some other online search engine. And I think some of the best training in writing effective ads is to simply peruse volunteer search engines, whether it's Hands On Connect or Volunteer Match or any other online search engine, and see which ads appeal to you and which do your eyes glaze over and do you want to scroll over, and really try and see which ones catch your eye. Are they the ones that start with the impact of the work, that say, help feed 30 families in an afternoon, or change a child's life by becoming a mentor? What are those ads, rather than, we need people 4 hours a week to unpack pallets of food? How do we actually catch them with the impact and then eventually get to the actual tasks and time? One note that you might want to refer to especially as you think about writing messages, and whether they be peer-to-peer or online messages or articles for newsletters, is how different generations tend to view volunteering and what appeals to different generations. So a couple little highlights. Of course, there are always exceptions because these are generalizations about millions and millions of people. But for baby boomers, for example, it has been effective to emphasize the organization's values and your people focus, communicate how they can contribute to service, and perhaps look at leadership opportunities. For Gen Xers, talk about the creative environment. These are Gen Xers were born between 1964 and 80 roughly, offer diverse work experiences, how they can be a player in contributing to your future. Millennials provide opportunities to learn new things, to provide social or group opportunities. And for Gen Z, it may be about Gen Z in their basically born from roughly 2000 on, workforce development, skill building for professionals, serving locally, helping globally, and networking potential. Having said all this, the truth is there's far more that unites the generations from boomers and beyond, Xers, millennials, and Gen Z, than separates them. The biggest divide is between the traditionalists born before and during World War II and everybody else, because boomers were the first generation to demand flexible opportunities, a chance to use their skills, to work with you as colleagues, and to really have a meaningful, impactful engagement. And that's true for Xers, millennials, and Gen Z as well. So don't get too caught up in generational pieces. Just make sure that you're resonating with this desire to really make a difference with your time. I want to take a moment first and just say, again, as Lily mentioned, feel free to add questions or thoughts to the chat. We will have time at the end, but if you have something on your mind now, get it down, and so you doesn't fly out your other ear, as happens to me all the time. And if you have ideas, also feel free to share those, because I'd love for you all to learn from each other. But for a moment, I want to pause and bring in a different piece that we don't often think about when we talk about recruitment, but is more relevant than ever, and that is sales. About 4 years ago, we at VQ were asked to partner with American National Red Cross, to help them develop their recruitment strategy and really to evolve their volunteer recruitment strategy. And you may be thinking, gosh, we have 5 volunteers, we have 300 volunteers, however many you have, but none of that compares to American National Red Cross with 300,000 volunteers. And yet there's a lot that we can learn, and that still comes down to that personal piece. One of the things that we were asked to do with American Red Cross was to look at the best practices from sales and see how that relates to volunteer recruitment. And it's interesting, despite the fact that according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, 1 in 9 Americans works in sales, that number has remained stable since 2000, which is the period during which this information technological revolution has really taken place, the birth of smartphones and the coming of age of the internet. But actually, that number of 1 in 9 is really limited. Millions and millions of Americans are involved in trying to persuade and move others to do something. Maybe not directly purchase an item, but we, everyone on this call, are very much involved in moving others to acquire something, part with something, adopt an idea, change opinions, or, as relates to volunteering, take an action. So because there was little data on this, Daniel Pink, who's a researcher and author, commissioned a survey to find out how Americans spend their time at work. And in a survey of 7,000 adult Americans, he found that Americans are spending 40% of their time at work in what he called non-sales selling activities. These activities include persuading, influencing, convincing, teaching, coaching, instructing, and of course, engaging. And my guess is that you're sitting there thinking, how much time each week do I spend convincing, persuading, inspiring? My guess is there's a good chance it's somewhere not far from 40% at least. So while research shows that 1 in 9 Americans work in sales, clearly so do the other 8. They are spending their days moving others and depending on their ability to do it well. We're basically all in the business of selling stuff, even if that stuff is ideas. So what can we learn from sales to help us with volunteer recruitment? Well, I'm going to share just 2 pieces roughly during the remaining half of our session together. The first one is about how we frame the information, how we frame the opportunity. And it's important to approach this with clarity, to bring clarity to your prospective volunteer. So Pink talks about 5 frames. And clarity is about how you curate the information for yourself and for your prospective volunteers. How much do we share? When do we share it? When do we tell it to people? So he talks about 5 frames. The one I want to talk about is the potential frame. Daniel Pink notes that the potential to be good at something can be preferred over actually being good at the very same thing. In other words, people find potential more interesting than accomplishment because it's more uncertain, and that uncertainty can lead people to think more deeply about the choices that they're making. And the more intensively we think about and process things, the more that can lead to generating more and better reasons why that option is a good choice. So what does all this mean? What does it come down to when we're recruiting volunteers? Thank you for your patience for me to talk about all this research. What does it mean? It means that we can shift from "we need you," that's not about potential, to instead doing things like encore.org does, which engages adults over 50 to find their purpose. That's about potential. Here's a great one from an organization called Boomers Leading Change. Skilled volunteering. Volunteering really doesn't encompass all you do. You become mentors and trusted advisors, a valued resource, and a respected expert. So my challenge to you is, as you write these messages, hopefully anchored in your thorough and comprehensive position descriptions, how can you tap into this idea of potential? What might volunteers become? A vital resource to their community? Might they become a leader of other volunteers? What are some of the things that they might be able to become? Because our messaging can tap into that potential, and that may help you attract new or different volunteers for your organization. Of course, where we share those messages is really important. And that is all about finding and identifying what your target audience is, who's most likely to be interested and available for your volunteer opportunities. So one of the worksheets that Lily will be sending out is a targeted recruitment brainstorm, which helps you think about who would have the skills and interest to do this assignment. So you're going to look at your position description and say, who has the skills, who has the interest, where will you find them, who knows them, and what information will the prospective volunteer need in order to make an informed decision. And we have to remember that at this point in the recruitment process, the only decision they need to make is, am I going to click through to learn more? Am I going to send an email? Am I going to keep having this conversation? Am I going to fill out an application? You want them to be intrigued enough to want to learn more. So who would have the skills and interest to do the assignment? If it's packing or delivering meals, then, I'm sure you've all thought a lot about this already. Are there students who have community service requirements that they need to fulfill? Are they people who need to have their own transportation, or are there other ways that they can fulfill their roles? If you're looking at perhaps reassessing the foods that are packaged and delivered, do you have virtual opportunities for nutrition students to, for example, help consult with your organization on a virtual role? So, I'm trying to give a lot of different examples. You'll have to see what your real needs are, but this helps you identify where, who's likely, where might we find them? And then the most important thing is, who knows them? Because peer-to-peer is one of the most effective ways to recruit volunteers, then it doesn't have to be all on your shoulders. Who are the volunteers, staff members, community members who may be able to link you to these individuals so that they can be your ambassador and pass the ask on to those people? And what do they need to know? What do your potential recruiters need to know in order to be able to make that ask? You'll also receive a volunteer cultivation plan, which can help you pull together not just the skills desired, but the target audiences, how you're going to reach them, what's the message, who's going to deliver it, by when, and how are you going to evaluate the success of this. So where can we share these types of messages? Well, in addition to peer-to-peer, certainly you want to consider local newspapers, local radio stations, social media, flyers, table tents at local coffee shops or hospitals and clinics, local organizational newsletters, senior center bulletin boards, faith-based organizations and meal sites, online search engines, and volunteer centers as well. Again, I invite you, if you wish, to use the chat and share any other additions to this list that you have found to be effective to get your messages out there. Now, just to keep this this whole idea of peer-to-peer going, but to kind of shake it up a little bit, I want to share a little bit about this concept of sort of network circles of influence. Because when we think about peer-to-peer, it's easy to, again, go to that STP, those same 10 people or same 2 people that are always the ones who are asking. How can we get beyond that? So I'd like to use this model from social media about our circles of influence. At the center of these concentric circles is your organization. One circle out from your organization is your community when it comes to kind of database management, et cetera, or social media. These are people who are in your database. They attend your events. They are connected to your organization. If they're on social media, they may follow it on Facebook or LinkedIn, or maybe they're physically nearby. Beyond the community is what's known as the network. They may not know you, or at least know you well, but they know your community. So they're the community of your community. And beyond that is the crowd, people you don't know and who don't know you and who may receive messages via the network. Now, for those of you in very small areas, you may say everybody knows everyone where we are, but some of you in mid-sized communities and larger urban areas, you definitely have the sense of, that there's definitely a crowd out there. And the relationship around this to volunteer recruitment is that often our efforts are poured into 2 areas: our community, those same 10 people, the people we know, and the crowd, the people out there. We put it out on a volunteer match or a Craigslist, and we just hope people we don't know approach us. But the richest place for recruitment is the network, the community of our community. So when we look at our current volunteers, our board members, people who participate in some of our programs, for example, how can we equip them to push our message out to their connections on social media, to their colleagues on LinkedIn, to their friends and family, the other parents on the side of the soccer field, sidelines that they might know. That's about really leveraging our network and making the most of that peer-to-peer recruitment. We want to get that rich middle ground. And here's an example of a human service agency that did just that. They had a young professionals initiative, and they found that it was really important for young professionals to volunteer in a geographically based in their own neighborhood, basically. And in order to help recruit new potential leaders for their junior board for this very large food pantry, they realized that they could create one-time projects in a convenient location. One of their mission areas, in addition to the food pantry, was helping adults who were aging out of the young adults aging out of the foster system. So they created opportunities for some of their junior leadership board to invite friends of theirs who had no connection to the organization to volunteer for a one-time event, a 2-hour vocational roundtable. They would invite their friends or colleagues to come and talk about, how do I deal with stress and happiness in the workplace? Or how do I deal with confrontation in the workplace for these young adults aging out of the foster care system? And they'd ask the volunteers to think about examples. How did you deal with stress? What's a sticky situation? And they would send that out, invite them to speak on this panel. And then, even though that didn't have to do with sort of their food pantry operations, the interesting thing was it was a way to get them in to meet and see their mission. And then the junior board members or the staff person set up a coffee with those individuals following that panel discussion, and really they got a chance to know them a little more. They'd set up their coffee, they'd talk about what additional skills and interests they might have, what appealed to them, and then tried to create a role, if it made sense, that matched with their interests and they could get more deeply involved in the organization. So follow-up was really key, and they held each other accountable for it. So again, it's not the same as saying I'm going to write an ad and post it online, but it was a very effective way to tap into some new youth leadership. Of course, there are a lot of other ways to create partnerships with organizations that already have individuals who believe in their mission. So, and partnerships are really vital wherever you're trying to find volunteers, rural areas, suburban areas, and urban areas. So in terms of food banks, obviously public health and medical providers, community action agencies, religious organizations, arts and cultural, especially as arts and culture are still not able to fully engage volunteers back in person because of COVID restrictions. I know of, and same with some hospitals, I know of organizations that are partnering with large hospitals or arts organizations and saying, until you're able to get fully up and running at capacity again, would it be okay? Would you be open to passing our volunteer opportunities at our food bank or our blood bank onto those volunteers in your database to say, we'd love to engage you in this time while we're still waiting for the rest of your former volunteer roles to open up. And one hospital in Delaware was so excited about this chance to keep her volunteers at the hospital engaged, even if it wasn't at the hospital, created and distributed t-shirts with the hospital name on it. So it says, such and such hospital in Delaware, and they encouraged their volunteers to wear those at their other volunteer sites. So they still got to feel loyal to their organization of choice, but could promote it while they were doing other work for other vital community needs. Service clubs, city or county officials, hospital volunteer groups, farm groups, veteran groups, all of those might serve as helpful partners for you in trying to build and get your message out there. I'll share another very different type of volunteer recruitment, not big numbers, little numbers, but really important little numbers from another organization from New Hampshire, the River Center. The River Center is an organization that provides all sorts of emergency services and support to families in need in their community. One of their skilled volunteer roles that they've had for years is a volunteer grant writer. And when we were working with them, they were really concerned about what happens if this grant writer leaves, because we don't have another grant writer on staff. This is a skilled volunteer role that in fact, the executive director, a woman named Margaret, didn't really have time or skills to do. So they wanted to create a sustainability plan, a backup plan for that grant writer. And very creatively, they decided in order to address the need for additional grant writers, they were going to think really about the community as a whole, not just their center. And the grant writer offered a course called Grant Writing Circles. The Grant Writing Circles were a series of 4-part class that taught anyone interested in learning how to write grants, how to write grants. The fascinating part was that the fee was there was no cash cost to taking the course. The fee was actually researching and writing one grant for the River Center. So even if the volunteer didn't stay on with the River Center, the River Center benefited from a handful of grants, grant proposals. And when I asked them, well, how did you feel if they took their new grant writing skills and used it at a different organization in town? And Margaret said, we're all about helping the community. So a rising tide floats all boats. Let's raise it up and help everybody. But in the meantime, they got a board member out of it, another grant writer who ended up moving away, but did the work virtually for them. And they helped other organizations as well. So that's a very unusual and different type of recruitment process, but it was really creative and very effective for them. I would be remiss if I didn't talk at least a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there are some great resources out there to help ensure that our recruitment tactics are leveraged to recruit from a variety of different types of communities. And when we do that, it's important to think about language, just like I said at the start. Not everyone volunteers, but it is a pretty universal value to help out neighbors, to assist, to support each other. So in this piece I've referenced here from the Minnesota Association for Volunteer Administration, among the 8 proven tactics for doing this is to shift your language. Of course, relationships is really important, embracing skills-based opportunities, to the best that you can, remove barriers that makes it difficult to serve. Barriers might be background checks where those aren't needed. Barriers might be transportation challenges, connectivity. So I encourage you to look at resources from MAVA and others to ensure that our tactics are appropriate and as inclusive as they can be. I want to share one other piece about that we learned from this research around sales before we open it up for questions. A lot of what I've been sharing is really designed to, in these early phases of recruitment, how do we ensure that what we're recruiting for are strategic and meaningful and pass the would anyone in their right mind do this test? How do we create messages and get those messages to the right audiences that are the most likely to respond? And yet, once we have someone sort of in our doorway, whether that's on our phone or literally sitting in our office, it's important to think about what we can learn from sales that might help us convert that prospective volunteer into someone who's committed. So during that conversation phase, one of the proven sales techniques is to really tune into what your prospective volunteer is thinking and what really motivates, what drives that individual to serve. And questions are a very powerful way, not only to help you tune in, but actually to help the prospect tune in to what motivates him or her. Questions are a window into understanding your prospect and tuning into their motivations while also helping them tune into their own motivations. So I want to share a 2-part question that was presented by a researcher, Michael Pantalone, in his work on influence. Let's say you have a volunteer who seems on the fence. Here's question 1. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 meaning not the least bit ready to volunteer with us and 10 meaning totally ready to sign up, how ready are you to volunteer with our organization, right? Whether it's, the Yavapai Apache Nation Food Bank or something in Tucson, whatever, how ready are you to engage with us? So someone says, oh, it's a 6, or maybe it's a 4, or, oh no, it's an 8, who knows? But I mentioned that this is a 2-part question, and I suspect you have a prediction of what the next question is. But if you're like me, you might be surprised at what the follow-up question is. Pantalone suggests we ask this: why didn't you pick a lower number? Not why didn't you pick a higher number? Why didn't you pick a lower number? This is the question that catches everyone off guard. Asking why the number isn't lower is actually a catalyst. Doing so forces the person to begin announcing her own reasons for volunteering. Instead of defending a current position, saying, oh, well, I can't be above a 6 because I have this schedule and I have to care for my grandchild and whatever, you're saying, what are all those reasons that get you to a 6? What are those reasons that I do want to engage? So maybe the possible answer is, well, I really want to make a difference in hunger in my neighborhood. Well, I know how much having a mentor can really change a young person's life. I know how much our community, our town needs volunteers to help address the issues here. It's a really powerful process, and it might be one you want to play with if you have someone interested but not yet ready to sign on the dotted line there. Another piece is if you have people showing up for an episodic opportunity, a group service day, one time, we often think about how do we onboard them and make sure that they know how to do their job safely and effectively while they're there. But do you have volunteers or time yourself, though I'm a big fan of engaging volunteers to help with this, who will help offboard them? How do you ensure that before they leave, they have a chance to say aloud, to hear how they made a difference, and to this point of sort of catalyzing people to articulate what was good about it, to say aloud what they enjoyed, how they think they made a difference, whom they met, to really say those things aloud and then provide them with an opportunity to understand what other options are available to them before they walk out the door, and following up with emails as well. If you enjoyed that, remember, here are all the different ways you made a difference. Here's how you can do that even more. Here's how you sign up again. Here's how else you can help. And maybe that's making a financial donation, right? And that doesn't have to all be on your shoulders. This is, you can engage volunteers to help be your frontline staff, frontline leaders, to engage volunteers a second time, to keep them coming back, so to speak. And sometimes this concept of the questions may help think about what we want to give those one-time volunteers the chance to say aloud, so that they'll begin processing why this was a valuable experience for them and choose to come back. Of course, whenever we're recruiting, it's really helpful to evaluate our success so that we're investing our time and efforts in the tactics that give us a return, right? And it doesn't only have to be success in filled time slots, right? If you're really assessing how ads on certain search engines or flyers in certain coffee shops, how that translates, you want to be tracking how many people, you might want to be tracking how many people inquired as a result of this, how many applications or registrations did you get as a result? If they're for skilled positions, were you doing interviewing? How many attended orientations? How many returned? There's a lot of different metrics. I think it's really important that we measure what's meaningful, not just what's measurable. So think about tracking what's really meaningful to you, but then making meaning out of it, seeing how are we going to use this information to determine where we post ads next, how else we equip volunteers to recruit on our behalf, et cetera. So I want to leave some time for questions. I don't see any yet in the Q&A. Great, Scott's asking. So I think we just want to share a couple wrap-up points while you're hopefully putting your questions in there. So get them in, and before we turn to that, I'm going to just turn it over to Lily for a moment to talk about what's next in the series. Lily?
Thank you so much, Beth. Just a reminder to go ahead and sign up for our AmeriCorps training on May 18th at 11 a.m. I went ahead and linked the registration link as well as our website for you to sign up for our other May trainings. As you can see, we have one other training along with the AmeriCorps training in May, Equally Inclusive Volunteer Pool. And I'll go ahead and let Beth talk about some of her June trainings.
Sure. So in June, I'm doing 2 others. Keep them coming back. Rethinking volunteer retention. So I'll be unpacking this. What is retention and how do you get them to come after being maybe a one-time volunteer, turn them into an ongoing volunteer? So we'll be unpacking that more. And then also talking about navigating sticky situations. We probably all have a list in our mind of situations that are a little tricky, and very few people love having difficult conversations. So we're going to try and unpack and demystify that. So taking the emotion out of it so that we can really equip our organizations for success moving forward. Great. And with that, I'd love to open it up for discussion. I will turn off the slides in a second. When you get the slides, you'll see links to our website where we have a lot of free and downloadable tools as well. And you're welcome to download those. And you'll be getting some of them and a few extras in the handouts via email as well. So I see that Scott had a question about job descriptions. Should I include that a background investigation is required in the position description? I do think in a position description, it is important to note under qualifications whether or not if a background check is required. I think having a background check for any individuals who are going to be in contact with vulnerable populations on behalf of your organization, in contact with your financial or other resources at your organization, background checks are really important. And I would also encourage us to think about, to be open to the fact that sometimes background checks are not necessarily required, even if we've done them that way all the time. But if it is required, I think it's important to note that in the position description, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in the advertisement. That comes with if someone's interested and they kind of click through and have to fill out the full application or understand what are the requirements in order to be fully placed, then I think it's important to disclose that that's important and be really clear whether the cost of that is the volunteer's burden or your organization is taking that on. So hopefully that's helpful. Oh, Lily, were there any other questions? That was one that I saw.
I don't believe so. If anyone has a question really fast right now, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves. Well, if there's no other questions, first off, thank you so much, Beth, for coming to speak with us today. It was very, very informative, and we look forward to your June presentations. Again, for everyone, lastly, this recording will be sent to you along with all the worksheets that Beth mentioned. And if you have any lingering questions, please email me. I'll go ahead and link my email or put my email in the chat box. And also with my email, I went ahead and put the survey link. Please fill out the survey. I'll send it out also when I send out this recording. This survey helps me help you by providing me better information on what you want to be trained on. But I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you during the next training.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.